Hello, and join me on another trip, part of the World Tour series, and our next destination is a country with the fourth largest car industry in the world, and is quickly becoming the next global superpower. The country of mystique, of ancient architecture, of spicy food, and also cars? Join me on my spiritual trip through the jungle that's the Indian car industry. This is episode 36 of the Automotive History series. This is the history of the Indian car industry. Wish me luck, Ganesh. Now, I'd love to tell you that the Indian car industry started off much like any other well-industrialized country, like I usually do. But I can't. Because, to be fair, the Indian car industry is a late bloomer. It has been reported that as far back as 1897, the first car hit the Indian roads, but it was imported by an Englishman. And that's about it. In the first half of the 20th century, only a handful of cars drove on Indian roads, and all were imported and not made locally. See, around this time India was still a colony of the British Empire and under British rule. And why should a nation bother with industrialization and maybe becoming self-aware one day and declare independency when you can oppress them and keep them busy with such trifles like harvesting crops? By the late 1940s, led by Gandhi, a strong independence movement rose up, and by 1947, India gained independence since the UK couldn't keep up and also couldn't be bothered further oppressing a foreign nation after being exhausted by the effects of the Second World War. Interestingly enough, it's also around the same time that the Indian car industry started to kick off. Like the rest of the world had other things to do, and yet here they are, those sneaky Indians building an auto empire. The big car names of today are mostly founded during this period. Hindustan Motors was founded in 1942, rivaling Premier Automobiles in 1944, Mahindra and Mahindra in 1945, Standard in 1948, and Tata also in 1945, and not to be confused with the Czechoslovakian Tatra, an entirely different episode. Following the independence in 1947, the government of India and the private sector launched efforts to create an automotive component manufacturing industry to supply the automobile industry as a first step in fighting back the day-to-day business of importing cars from outside and not making them locally. And there it is again, the import tariffs. By 1952, the Indian government imposed import tariffs on cars that were brought in from overseas. In line of building a strong new nation, a national car industry, the thing to have in those days, had to be part of it. The newly found Tariff Commission came up with a plan where local manufacturing was encouraged and foreign companies that did not produce cars locally were getting kicked out. By 1954, companies like the American General Motors and the Ford Motor Company, as well as the British Rootes Group, instantly left the country. But who needs those guys anyway, right? From here on out, it's only the long way up, right? Well, not really. The policies used by the Tariff Commission eventually became known as the Licensing Raj, which, as it turned out, would not encourage but limit the Indian car industry. It was a bureaucratic mess. Some 80 government agencies had to be pleased before changes in practically everything were getting through, which slowed down car production, resulting in very long waiting times for new cars. But amidst all of this, there was still room for the creation of the very first Indian car. Before that, local Indian companies mostly did the final assembly of European and American car models, commissioned by and on the license of these respective car makers. But now it was time for a car completely constructed on Indian soil. And as it turns out, it was Hindustan Motors that gained the bragging rights for doing so, presenting the Hindustan Ambassador for 1957, India's very first national car. The Ambassador is not a unique design, the car is a direct rebadge of the British Morris Oxford Series 3. The car was praised for its roominess and sturdiness, however, a perfect fit for the Indian roads. And so, what is Holden to Australia and the Beetle to Germany, so is the Hindustan Ambassador the car that put India on wheels. Really, through legitimate and illegitimate reasons, the car became a cult classic. 2/3 of the cars in India were ambassadors at one time. And the car remained almost unchanged throughout its production life, which lasted all the way until 2014. That is 2014. I am not lying. Back in 2014, you could buy a futuristic Tesla or, a Hindustan Ambassador. Before we continue, a quick side note. The Ambassador was the very first Indian-made car, but not truly Indian as it was a badge job based on a British model. However, one source mentions that around the same time of the Ambi, two men were tasked by a local Maharaja to find a nice and luxurious car for him. The two men couldn't find a car that would match the whims of their highness and decided, oh what the hell, why don't we make a car on our own? And off they went to make their own car. And the result of this idea was the Aravind Palace Special for 1965, and in my book, the first true Indian car. The car featured a very American-inspired design with plenty of chrome, dual headlights and tail fins, and was priced around 5,000 rupees. The motoring press picked up on this car, and the two men had plans to make a car company out of it by building a new version named the Model 3, but ultimately failed in doing so because the government was not willing to help them financially, as they preferred to work with the more established companies. Anyway, I'm getting off track here. Hindustan might have been the first, but rivaling Standard, that is the British car maker Standard, also released several models like the 8 and 10, eventually evolving in India-specific models. And Premier quickly followed with the Premier Padmini for 1964, a car heavily based on the Fiat 1100. Although companies like Hindustan and Premier had the Indian car market covered, they were extremely hampered by the licensing Raj, and even if they did manage to sell cars, it was to a population where the majority was still very poor. 1 in every 1,000 citizens owned a car, as the annual road tax was about half the annual income of the average Indian. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the Indian car market remained very small. What wasn't so small, however, was the market for motorized vehicles that were anything but cars. Think of farm tractors, off-roaders, freight trucks, farm trucks, pickup trucks, and trucks. And lesser-wheeled vehicles like tuk-tuks and especially scooters and motorcycles. Companies like Mahindra & Mahindra and Tata had a great time selling commercial vehicles and tractors. By the 1970s, the Indian car industry was pretty straightforward. Hindustan and Standard and Premier still dominated the limited passenger car market, and the rest of the companies made commercial vehicles for whatever purpose. The government started the Green Revolution plan to further develop agriculture, also stimulating the sale of trucks and tractors. Price controls were lifted on passenger cars, but that didn't do much. Now, this all led to a problem that if someone was able to afford a car for once in their life, they would have been given the choice between a car with a 20-year-old design and technology or a car with 15-year-old design and technology. Your choice. And this had to change. In 1973, after an initial tender, the Indian government granted 3 entities new licenses to produce a new and updated small affordable economy car for the masses. But these entities were not allowed to contact or collaborate with foreign car makers. It all had to happen within India. The first entity, a company or person, my Indian is not that good to determine which is which, that was granted a license was Manubhai Thakkar. But there's simply nothing known about it, so I'll skip this. The second entity was a company called Sunrise Auto Industries, also known as Sipani. Sipani went to work to create their version of the compact economy car theme, which resulted in the, fiberglass Sipani Badal for 1975, India's very first 3-wheeled car. Despite Sipani stressing that the car was not inspired by, it looked an awful lot like the English Reliant Robin. But in reality, the car was more like a tuk-tuk turned into a passenger car. The Badal did not fare well, partly because of its odd door configuration. The car had 1 door on the driver's side and 2 doors on the passenger side and no operable rear hatch, whereas many Indians were accustomed to having 4 doors and a trunk, so a sedan. Not to mention that the cars with 2 doors were banned in half of the country for some odd reason. Sipani reckoned the mistake and tried again, now with the Sipani Dolphin for 1982. This was unfortunately not an in-house design, but a rebatch of the British Reliant Kitten. The Kitten was Reliant's attempt at making a four-wheeled car, based on the three-wheeled Robin, and by the early 80s, when the company went belly up, they sold the plans to Sipani, and the Reliant Kitten was given a second life as the Sipani Dolphin, all the way until the 1990s. The car sure was a success. It even gained some rally credentials through its years. But let's not forget that there was a third entity that was granted a license, and here is where it gets interesting. This entity was a company by the name of Maruti Motors Limited. Through the Companies Act, Maruti became incorporated and the Indian government appointed a government official to be part of the managing board of the company. The official was Sanjay Gandhi, a man with no previous experience in the auto industry whatsoever. It became pretty clear that this was going nowhere, and even if it did, assembling a car and all of its components entirely within India was a tough job. India needed help from the outside. There were some talks with the German Volkswagen to start up a Beetle production, but it also went nowhere. This was a shit show from the start, and Sanjay Gandhi was heavily criticized and accused of corruption. A combination of an untimely death of Sanjay and the rise of a new government gave Maruti Motors a second chance. Knowing that they had to work with a company from the outside, it was the Japanese Suzuki that suddenly came into the picture. Suzuki already had a long-standing experience with making small and very fuel-efficient economy cars, so this was a good choice. In 1982, a joint venture agreement was signed between Maruti and Suzuki, and they went to work to create a new chapter in the development of the Indian car industry. And in December 1983, the Maruti 800 was released, based on the Suzuki Alto, where the 800 was a reference to the engine, which was 800 cc's, or 48 cubic inch. Finally, there was a little buzz in the Indian car market. You could buy the ancient and now dated Hindustan Ambassador or the shiny, new, fuel-efficient compact Maruti 800, and many Indians did. The 800 became the second longest production model run in India's history and was officially sold in this shape and form until 2010, when it no longer complied with the new emission standards, but until that sold over 2.6 million times. Talking about being a late bloomer, by the late 1980s, the choice of flavors in cars still remained pretty narrow. That was until the start of the 1990s, when the Indian government decided to open up the country and privatize the economy. They got rid of the licensing Raj, which was hopelessly outdated at this point. The effects were immediate. By the mid-1990s, many foreign car makers found their way to India. Toyota, Hyundai and others quickly set up shop or helped the local economy through partnerships and joint ventures. And there was even room for completely Indian cars. Tata, already established in the 1950s, launched their first passenger car in 1991, the Sierra SUV, and many other models followed suit. Hindustan formed a partnership with General Motors and sold Opel vehicles. Mahindra & Mahindra strongly focused on creating new and updated SUVs, and Premier teamed up with the French Peugeot to sell the 308. They also had a short-lived relationship with Fiat, but that was plagued with quality issues and corruption scandals. I know, same old, same old. By the 2000s, the Indian automotive market was a colorful place. Never was there ever so much to choose from, but the range of cars also saw some long-lasting and ancient veterans. Not to mention the omnipresent truck, tuk-tuk and motorcycle market. But it was around this time that Tata wanted to pull the same trick Maruti did in the 1980s with the 800. See, the market for scooters and motorcycles was still pretty sizable, and Tata wanted to get the Indians off their bikes and into cars. Seeing their success with the ultra-small trucks and the popular Tata Indica compact car, this new vehicle could potentially be another success waiting around the corner. Tata set out to create the cheapest car available in India, possibly even the entire world. A new people's car, much like the Volkswagen Beetle. A new people's car that offered more than a Briggs & Stratton Flyer, but cost less than a Volkswagen Beetle. It had to meet your standard list of baseline requirements a car should have, namely very fuel efficient, somewhat safe, 4 doors, and very low retail price. In 2008, after a couple years of development, Tata proudly presented India the world's cheapest car, the Tata Nano. Powered by a 2-cylinder engine making 37 horsepower, it had a speedometer. That's about it. Tata promised a lot of things, including high sales numbers. But that's about it. The Nano did not have the effect on the Indian car market that Tata was hoping for. Many Indians were simply not interested. And I can add another 10 minutes to the video going over every single detail about why the Nano failed, but the parallels with the American Edsel from the 1950s is almost uncanny. Let's just say it was a combination of high hopes and very mediocre results. The Nano tried to fill a gap that didn't exist. The Indians that rode motorcycles kept riding on their bikes, and the Indians who were interested in buying a car went straight to the Maruti dealers to buy the 800, which really wasn't any more expensive than a Nano, but offered a lot more car. Despite the failure, Tata claimed that they were emotionally too invested to stop the production, and the Nano assembly continued until 2018. And that brings us to the present day. The Indian car industry is a fast-developing industry, already the 4th largest in the world, and it's not only foreign cars. Hindustan gave up on making the Ambassador, thank God. Premier had stopped making normal passenger cars altogether, but Mahindra & Mahindra offer a fine selection of off-roaders and SUVs. And so does Tata, offering compact and small SUVs like the Harrier and compact economy cars like the Tigor. And most of these models are truly Indian, and not some obscure rebadge from another company. And then there is Maruti, which currently is the largest player in India with a 40% market share, mostly offering rebadged Suzuki models. Who knows where this country's industry is going? And who knows, maybe we will be buying an Indian car in the near future. Time will tell.